One medieval nun shocked Europe by demanding extreme poverty, reviving a dead child, and forcing the Church itself to return to the radical ideals of St. Francis. This is the story of St. Colette of Corbie. On March 6th, the Church remembers a woman who took on comfortable religion and won. Her name is St. Colette of Corbie, a French Franciscan reformer and foundress. She lived in a Europe split by politics, plague memories, and a divided papacy. Yet, she rebuilt a severe, joyful form of poverty that still exists in monasteries today. Colette was born Nicolette Beaulieu on the 13th January 1381 in Corbie in Picardy, northern France. Her father, Robert Beaulieu, worked as a carpenter for the Benedictine Abbey of Corbie. Her mother was Marguerite Moyon, and both parents were described as poor and elderly. Later tradition says they had prayed to Saint Nicholas for a child, and they named her for him. Nicolette became Colette, the name history kept, small and affectionate, like her early life. The world around Corbie was not peaceful or stable, and the Church itself was under strain. Western Schism had competing papal claimants, with Rome and Avignon dividing loyalties. In France, the Avignon claimant was widely treated as the legitimate pope for many years. Colette grew up inside that confusion, learning piety without the luxury of certainty or ease. When Colette was still young, her parents died in 1399, leaving her an orphan in her teens. Family and society expected a marriage, but she wanted a life given fully to God. She tried a path with the Beguines, women living a religious life without formal vows. It was good, but to her it felt too mild, too safe, too comfortable for her conscience. She then entered a Benedictine community as a lay sister, likely to avoid being forced into marriage. Even there, she felt she had not found the sharp edge of the gospel she was seeking. In September 1402, she received the habit of the Third Order of St. Francis. Under the direction of the abbot of Corbie, she became a hermit near the abbey church. For 4 years, from 1402 to 1406, she lived in intense prayer, penance, and simplicity. Sources describe her as a recluse, an anchoress-like figure, with a life narrowed to God alone. It was a hidden life, but it was also a furnace, and in that furnace her mission was forged. Colette reported dreams and visions that pushed her beyond private holiness into public reform. She believed St. Francis himself was calling her to restore the orders he had founded. Her target was the Second Order, the Poor Clares, founded by St. Clare of Assisi. By Colette's time, some monasteries had softened their discipline and accepted stable income. Colette believed the original Franciscan ideal required radical poverty, enclosure, and austerity. Visions do not build monasteries by themselves, so Colette needed help from real people. A key ally was a Franciscan friar, Henry of Beaume, who became her confessor and guide. With his backing, Colette took a daring step into the political minefield of her era. In October 1406, she traveled to Nice, in southern France, to meet Benedict XIII of Avignon. Benedict XIII, Padre de Luna, was an anti-pope by later Catholic judgment, but France recognized him then. Colette did not go to debate ecclesiology. She went to get authority to reform a wounded order. Benedict received her and allowed her to transfer to the Poor Clares. He issued papal bulls between 1406 and 1412 that empowered her to found new monasteries and reform existing ones. This detail matters because it shows the reform was not a private rebellion against the Church. It was an attempt to heal the Church's religious life from the inside with formal permission. Colette's work began under contested authority, yet her holiness outlived the politics that enabled it. With the approval of the Countess of Geneva and the support of Henry of Beaume, she began. Early efforts took place around Beaune, in Burgundy, and the region's networks mattered. Noble patrons, bishops, and towns all had interests, and a strict reform could frighten donors. A monastery that rejects income and embraces perpetual fasting sounds unstable to practical minds. Colette had to persuade people that radical dependence on providence was not insanity, but faith. In 1410, she opened her first successful reformed monastery at Besançon. The house was described as semi-derelict, an almost abandoned community of urbanist Poor Clares. She did not choose a polished foundation with money and prestige. She chose a place that matched the humility and repair work her reform demanded. From Besançon, the movement spread like a spark, finding dry wood across Europe. The next years show a pattern that would define her whole life. A town would invite her, a community would hesitate, and she would insist on the original rule. New foundations followed, including Auxonne in 1412 and Poligny in 1415. Her reform also reached Amiens and other cities in France and the Burgundian territories. Outside France, it spread to places like Heidelberg in Germany, with a foundation dated 1444. By the end of her life, sources speak of 17 or 18 monasteries formed or reformed under her spirit. If you imagine this as a gentle nun giving advice, you miss the point. Colette's reform demanded concrete sacrifices that touched daily survival. Her nuns were to have no fixed income, no comfortable endowments, and no safe financial base. They were to live strict enclosure, rigorous poverty, and perpetual fasting and abstinence. The barefoot detail is remembered because it symbolized a refusal to cushion the body from discipleship. To keep such a movement from collapsing into chaos, Colette needed a clear structure. Her communities followed the rule of Saint Clare, interpreted in a stricter, primitive way. They also followed constitutions associated with her reform, later approved by Franciscan authorities. A minister general of the friars, William of Casale, approved constitutions in 1434. Later, popes confirmed these constitutions in a series of approvals, including Nicholas V in 1448. Further confirmations are recorded under Pius II in 1458 and Sixtus IV in 1482. What began as one woman's fire became a stabilized institution inside the church. Colette's reform did not stay confined to nuns. Together with Henry of Beaume, she helped inspire a reform among Franciscan friars too. These friars were sometimes called Coletans, connected to the monasteries of the Reformed nuns. They never became a major independent branch, but they show the reform's wider influence. By 1448, there were said to be 13 friaries of this movement attached to Colettine houses. In 1570, Pope Leo X merged smaller reform groups into the broader observant Franciscans. A reformer's story is not only about rules, it is also about reputation and spiritual power. Colette was widely believed to work miracles, and stories gathered around her even in her lifetime. Biographers describe cures, multiplication of food or wine, and other signs of God's favor. Two miracle stories are especially tied to her public mission and to her patronage today. The first happened during her journey to Nice to meet Benedict XIII in 1406. She stayed with friends, and the host's wife went into a dangerous labor with their third child. Colette went to a local church and prayed intensely for the mother's life. The woman survived and gave birth successfully, and the family credited Colette's intercession. The baby girl was named Petronilla, and tradition says she later entered a monastery founded by Colette. Petronilla is remembered as becoming Colette's secretary and later a biographer, preserving the story. The second famous account is darker and more dramatic, and it changed public suspicion into support. After authorization to impose strict poverty at Besançon, townspeople feared the nuns would become beggars. Their anxiety was practical, not purely hostile, because feeding an enclosed community costs something. In that setting, tradition says Colette revived a stillborn child. The story includes a striking detail. She wrapped the child in the veil associated with her reception into the Poor Clares. Whether one reads it as literal history or devotional memory, the message was clear to the crowd. God could provide for this monastery, and Colette's reform was not a threat, but a blessing. These miracle traditions connect directly to her patronage. Saint Colette is invoked by women seeking to conceive, by expectant mothers, and by families with sick infants. Her life contained both the longing for life and the confrontation with death. She knew fragile households, orphanhood, and the fear of childbirth in a pre-modern world. So it makes sense that ordinary people remember her not as an administrator, but as a motherly intercessor. Yet, there is also a sterner side to her holiness that modern ears can misunderstand. Colette's austerity was not self-hatred, and it was not a stunt for attention. In Franciscan terms, it was a way to strip life down until love is all that remains. The purpose of poverty was freedom from ownership, so the heart could be owned by God. The purpose of casting was not misery, but clarity, training desire to obey rather than dominate. Her strict enclosure was not a rejection of the world, but a choice to fight for it through prayer. Late in her life, Colette's reform reached Flanders in a lasting way. A Colettine community in Ghent is dated by some accounts to 1442, and she died there. Other summaries list Ghent earlier in the spread of foundations, showing how medieval timelines can vary. What is certain is that Ghent became closely associated with her final years and her death. She died on 6th March 1447, at about 66 years old after decades of founding and governing. Colette's story then moves from local memory to official recognition. The Church beatified her on the 23rd of January 1740 under Pope Clement XII. She was canonized on 24th of May 1807 by Pope Pius VII, formally naming her a saint for the whole Church. Her liturgical feast is March 6th, though the Franciscan family also keeps her memory on February 7th. These dates matter because they show that reform can take centuries to be fully honored, yet it endures. What did Colette actually leave behind, apart from inspiring stories? She left communities of women living the gospel with frightening consistency. The Colettine Poor Clares remain a distinct observance inside the wider Poor Clare tradition. Their identity is not a brand, it is a method, a way of interpreting Saint Clare through Colette's discipline. Historically, the reform spread across France and beyond, and later reached Britain, Ireland, and the United States. Even when modern Europe grew less friendly to contemplative life, her spirit crossed borders and survived. If you want the most practical summary of her impact, it is this. Colette proved that reform is not first a program, but a person who will live the cost. She did not write polemics against laxity. She founded places where the original rule could be lived again. She did not wait for perfect conditions. She began in near ruins and built with prayer and credibility. She did not shrink from messy church politics. She used the authority available to her to do good. And she did not treat miracles as a marketing plan. They followed her as people watched her life. On March 6th, her feast confronts a modern temptation. We often want Christianity to be inspiring, but not demanding, aesthetic, but not costly. Saint Colette offers a different picture, quiet and enclosed, yet more radical than many revolutions. Her revolution was interior, aimed at the appetites, the fear of insecurity, and the need to control outcomes. She teaches that holiness can be surgical, cutting away comforts so that love becomes unconfused and strong. So if you remember one image, make it simple. A woman from a small town in Picardy, orphaned, unimportant by worldly measures, walking barefoot into history. She rebuilds forgotten monasteries, insists on poverty, and survives political chaos without becoming cynical. She prays for mothers in labor, and the fearful find hope again. Then she dies in Ghent, leaving behind a living network of prayer that still speaks across centuries. Saint Colette of Corbie, pray for us.